Well, welcome to this webinar. I'm Daniel Levine, host of Global Genes Rarecast, and today we're going to talk about early and often reimagining patient community engagement to improve clinical trials feasibility. A white paper produced by the Global Genes Corporate Alliance that included the participation of members of the Global Gene Global Advocacy Alliance. We've got a panel of patient advocates from within industry to talk about the paper, as well as their own experiences working to drive deeper engagement between their drug development teams and patient communities, and the critical role this plays in improving the cost, time, and success rates of rare disease clinical trials. Our panelists today include Wendy Erler, Vice President and Global Head of Patient Experience, Patient Advocacy, and Patient and Caregiver Insights for Alexion Rare Disease, and co-chair of the Global Genes Corporate Alliance, Molly White, Vice President of Strategic Initiatives for Dyne Therapeutics, and Parisa Sanandaji, Executive Director of Patient Advocacy, Policy, and Engagement for Stoke Therapeutics, and incoming co-chair of the Global Genes Corporate Alliance. Thank you all for joining us today. Wendy, as the co-chair of the Global Genes Corporate Alliance, can you take a moment to explain what the Corporate Alliance is and why it created this white paper? What need was it trying to address?
Thanks so much, Danny, and thank you to everyone who's joining. Specifically to the Global Genes Corporate Alliance, it's a really unique and meaningful opportunity for those of us working in rare disease in the industry space, whether it's CRO or pharmaceutical biotech companies, others associated with industry, to come together and align on common initiatives where, partnering with Global Genes, we can accelerate innovative research, innovative approaches, and understanding of rare disease at scale. So joining the Corporate Alliance and then meaningfully participating in projects like the one you're going to hear about today is a really unique and special opportunity for those of us working in rare.
Well, what was the need that the Corporate Alliance was trying to address with this paper?
So we really set about identifying a project where we could, as a Corporate Alliance, come together in an area of rare disease, think about it from that pre-competitive, non-competitive space, but truly amplify and accelerate what we can do for the rare disease community at large. And there's no better place than Global Genes to do this type of work, because Global Genes is working across the entire community and not specific disease areas where industry might be focused, for example. So we set out to gather robust data and testimonials, because verbatims, particularly patient verbatims, are some of the most important data we have, to build a foundation for highlighting the value of patient engagement in a differentiated way across the whole ecosystem of drug development. So I think we can all agree, we all understand patient centricity matters and patient engagement is important. But there are a few places we're really describing the impact from time savings, cost savings, and more importantly, accelerating development actually is captured. So that's what we set about to do, was really talk about a specific sort of tactical part of research and development and where the impact of meaningful engagement can happen. And in many cases, that is partnering with an organization like Global Genes that can connect us to these communities early.
People are going to hear the term feasibility today, but what is that term meant in regards to clinical trials?
So let's talk a little bit about the hypothesis was for this paper that drug development companies, so big pharma research institutions, are really still starting early clinical trials and early development, and specifically the feasibility process, without necessarily the right amount of patient and advocacy group engagement. So that was the hypothesis. We then embarked on a rigorous process to gather meaningful data and challenge the assumptions, and ultimately focused on feasibility as a place to drive change, accelerate information inputs, and engage in a productive and meaningful way. So to your question specifically, if we think about what does feasibility mean, it's really twofold. Any study or research project, pharmaceutical or investigator initiated, needs a review to be sure that the research site and the process can keep going and afford to implement a full protocol. And that's high level how we describe feasibility. But it also applies to a tactical process in clinical research of actually assessing the protocol from the perspective of what does the population need, what are the accrual targets, the trial timeline, what procedures and assessments can actually be executed, and the involvement of people in this study. And then feasibility as a process includes the analysis of the true cost of conducting the study. So back to our original hypothesis, it makes so much sense and it seems so simple, but it's not happening necessarily in a constructive and consistent way across R&D. What makes sense is that the patient community be involved early. They have access to almost all the type of information we're trying to assess and really relevant inputs that other people giving that information might have a view to it, but not the same type of access to the actual patient experience and patient information.
Well, how do drug developers typically go about that process of determining the feasibility of a clinical study?
So we can talk about that throughout today and it'd be a good point of discussion, but at a very high level, most typically within industry, from a research perspective, there's a team within typically clinical operations or early R&D who brings in outside counsel to advise on feasibility, depending on those different pieces that are informing feasibility. Specific to something like site selection or identifying key principal investigators, that might happen through an advisory board. It might happen through contracting a clinical research organization or another external research company to bring that information in. So those data might be valid, but what they miss is the actual patient advocacy group experience of, yes, that site might have a key investigator and they might be really interested in this clinical trial area, but they have 5 other studies, for example. So the idea of being able to recruit 1 or 2 patients for a rare disease study becomes more and more complex. Whereas the advocacy group can actually inform and advise on very detailed specifics at the site level, and also really give information about what worked in a site and what didn't. And that type of information gathered early, added to potentially some of the other external inputs, is going to ensure a far more rigorous and accurate feasibility process. Today, we know that feasibility in enrolling patients is the largest cost driver of clinical trials. It accounts for about 32% of the cost. Patient retention and keeping people in the study accounts for another 14%. So if you get the right information early, maybe we can drive that down and do better, which means we're going to execute better research faster, which only serves patients in the long run. And it'd be great if Molly could weigh in a little bit on her experience. I don't think in many of these rare disease areas we should ever start feasibility without talking to the patient group, but it'd be great to hear from Molly too.
Well, how good are drug developers at actually predicting the time and cost of a clinical trial?
I think that there's a kind of an algorithm for that really does inform. And, to that specific question, do we get it right? I don't think so, because even today, protocol amendments, which are changes that happen after the initial protocol is implemented. So you go through all the feasibility, you get patient input to a protocol, maybe, maybe not, you have a protocol, and then you get ready to start the clinical trial. And then you start to learn more and more, because now all of a sudden you're really engaged at the field level, and amendments happen because either the trial is not enrolling, or you're getting feedback from physicians that something's wrong with the way the study has been designed, or there are a lot of people who screen for the study and then aren't accepted. Whatever the input is, there are a significant number of amendments, and this costs an average of $140,000 for a phase 2 trial. It grows to double and triple that in the case of a phase 3 trial. So from a just pure perspective, you have an algorithm that helps determine what a trial is going to cost and the budget that gets put into the system. But then the reality is 57% of protocols had at least one substantial amendment. and 45% were deemed avoidable in a study that Tufts Medical Center did.
Experienced rare disease drug developers will tell you that what might work for determining feasibility for clinical trials in more common diseases won't work for rare diseases. Why is that? What additional challenges do conducting clinical trials in a rare disease pose?
So that's kind of the nexus of the whole differentiation in rare from bigger population condition studies. Across the rare disease community, we know there are, just by definition of rare, fewer people who would be interested in and or eligible for a clinical study, and they're widely dispersed. So in rare disease research, we're often opening clinical trial sites with a goal of enrolling under 5 or 6 patients in that trial. So the numbers are already really small. And if you have a number of people that screen for the study and then aren't eligible or don't join, or I hate this term, screen fail, you're then limiting even further the opportunity to actually successfully get a trial up and running in a particular site. And then the experts in rare disease are widely dispersed. So you may have one clinical trial center in a country and people have to travel significant distance. And all of those inputs factor into the feasibility analysis, but really having on the ground information. We were going to open a study in Italy and we had a location picked out. And then we learned from a patient group that of their population of people participating in work with their patient advocacy organization, the majority of them lived in a whole nother part of the country. So it didn't mean we necessarily had to change our site, but we had to think about if we were going to bring people in from longer distances, what did that require? And or should we be looking at a different site closer to where most of the people were living? So you can get a lot of information that can make actually executing a rare disease clinical trial a little bit easier.
Well, when do drug developers typically begin to engage a patient community, and when's the right time to do that?
So I'll answer the second part of the question first. The right time is now. It's never too early, and you are only ever going to be too late if you don't engage at the very beginning of the conversations about a concept and potentially going into an area. We try to engage in the early preclinical phase, but the way you engage and what that means for the long term has to be taken into consideration. So we have a very long-term view. We engage really early, and we have a team of experts that we've hired to do this work. So it's a very unique capability, but we have a full team to do this. And then they really drive, depending on how much information we can share transparently externally, where we are in the process of making commitments and what we're looking for, they really drive that type of engagement. So we're bringing together everyone at the table and having mutual beneficial relationships. And we're also really have to have the process in place to be able to have this transparent communication. So if you don't go forward, you're communicating that right away, or if something happens along the way and a trial closes or priorities change, we're very committed to consistently partnering and keeping the information updated. And then we've built mechanisms so that if there are patient groups who work in this space and are able to help with processes like feasibility, that we're working with them within their process. So it adds a little bit of extra rigor in saying, well, this patient group is willing to provide clinical trial awareness or protocol input or burden of disease input. And then we factor that into our planning early so that we are engaging in the right way as much as possible.
What's the business case for an early and often approach through patient engagement? Why should be companies doing this? Why is it in their interest?
Well, first of all, what we heard in this work, and I hope everybody downloads this paper and takes it into all of your cross-functional partners to share, we heard that it does matter and it does improve the timelines and the budget. Every day that a company extends the timeline for a clinical trial, we can lose between 600,000 and 8 million in future successful marketing of that product. So even getting that drug to market, much less future future having it be accessible. So there's significant cost involved in extending time, and the data show that engaging early with patient advocacy groups and meaningfully listen to what we learn from them and having that input on our decision making does in fact save costs. So there's a business rationale that can be really tracked to dollars and cents, but there's also the ethical side of this, that it's the right thing to do. We shouldn't make many decisions, if any, without a patient voice at the table. So it really does then also connect employees to their purpose in a meaningful way, that everyone's doing the work in the right way.
And if you haven't downloaded the paper, I noticed that Gio just put a link into the chat. You could download it there. But let's talk about the actual experiences of companies that engage with patient communities early and often. Molly, Dyne Therapeutics is developing therapies for neuromuscular diseases, including Duchenne muscular dystrophy and myotonic dystrophy. One advantage here is that there are well-established patient organizations involved in research in these areas. Prior to Dyne, you headed one of these. Does it make it easier to engage with patient organizations that are that focused?
Yes. Thank you for having me. Delighted to be here with such a great group. I think for me, it made a huge difference, both on the industry side and on the community side. Being able to go in and work on the myotonic dystrophy study early enabled me to sort of offer up a pseudo patient view on the disease burden, on the experience of living with myotonic dystrophy and so forth, with a group of people, I think Wendy mentioned this too, that had never worked in neuromuscular. When you work in a lot of these smaller biotech companies, you may be working with experts who've been pulled in from renal disease or oncology or diseases that are not at all similar to a rare neuromuscular disease that you're currently working on. And you may bring assumptions about ways that you can design a study, how patients will respond, what patients are willing to do, that might be completely flawed. So I think it's important to have patient voice early. And I think having had the experience of running the Myotonic Dystrophy Foundation for 8 years and doing a lot of industry development work in addition to care development work helped me provide some insights that were important to making sure that the study started in the right place and went in the right direction.
And there's a wonderful paper that Molly co-authored on Dyne's experience. I encourage all of you to look for that online. It's referred to in the early and often paper. But Molly, in planning the clinical trials, Dyne used community advisory boards to learn from the patient community. Can you describe what a community advisory board is, who was on them, and how Dyne uses them to inform its clinical studies?
So we had advisory boards, obviously, from a lot of different stakeholder groups, from KOLs, from the patient community, and so forth. With the patient community advisory boards, we pulled patients, both domestic and ex-US, who were either caregivers of people living with these diseases or people living with the diseases themselves. And we organized the workshop so that we had what we hoped was the most representative cohort of individuals to provide feedback. We did a series of pre-workshops, and we shared the draft protocol for the study. We shared the consent form, which, as you guys know, is long and arduous and meant to be patient-friendly and often isn't. And other documents that we felt really needed expert feedback from that particular stakeholder group, which in this case was people living with these diseases.
And what specific information do you want to get from these advisory boards? What are you hoping to understand to inform better drug development?
We wanted to know whether they thought the assessments that we had identified were the right assessments. We wanted to know if they felt they were priority. We wanted to know if they felt that they would be the most sensitive, and how experiencing those assessments would affect, their day, how burdensome they were. We wanted to know how they felt about placebo and what their perspective was on whether or not a placebo was acceptable and what it needed to look like. We talked about inclusion exclusion criteria, and we got their input on that. And we talked a lot about travel and sites per the conversation that Wendy started. I think when you think about clinical trials, the assumption is that patients are extremely eager to get into these studies, and they are, but they need to know what the data are that are driving the drug development work that you did, and whether that data are reasonable, and whether they can feel that the work was high quality and that they can feel safe. They need to understand what the clinic visit day is going to look like, and they need to understand whether the burden of trying to get to that site on a however often basis, monthly, bi-monthly basis, is going to be worth the investment. Because for a lot of these folks to travel, many of them have to travel with caregivers. Travel can be exhausting. If you have any kind of mobility issues and you use a chair or anything like that, it makes travel that much harder. And there are obstacles like that that have to be considered. And we needed good feedback on that in order to understand where we could cite the studies and how we could really recruit.
And who's at the table from the Dine side, and what's the process for taking what you learn and hear at these sessions and then apply it to what you're doing?
So we had a cross-functional team that included ClinOps, clinical development, the drug development leads for each of the diseases, and communications and other folks. We also taped, obviously, the workshops. We created full video capture and a transcript, and then a final report. And the final report is presented out to all of the functional groups and shared along with the transcript. And then, of course, we also circled it back to the participants to make sure that what was captured was accurate.
And are there an example or two you can offer on how Dine was able to take what it learned from these interactions with the patient community and actually change what it was planning to do, and why?
Well, I can say that it definitely changed, and you see some of this in the publication that you cited. We actually list what changed as a result of the input. We significantly expanded the travel program, and it became significantly more inclusive and comprehensive and expensive as a result. We refined the inclusion exclusion criteria. We definitely refined the clinic visit design. It's really important, for instance, that when you bring in myotonic dystrophy community members, that they can sleep in at the site the night before and be able to get up refreshed. There are issues with warm-up effect and so forth with myotonia, if you're going to test for that, that need to be accounted for. We definitely heard about home visits, and we factored in home visits when possible as a result of the feedback. We actually structured the clinic visits so that there were rest periods between certain assessments so that people participating could participate effectively in all of the assessments. And we also did the best we could to make the consent form as accessible as possible. And we created, age-appropriate content, both for instance, young boys living with Duchenne as well as their caregivers, to make sure that the content was really accessible.
There may be reasons why you're unable to implement a suggestion from a patient organization. There may be a regulatory requirement that means you have to collect certain data in a certain way. Do you ever go back to the community and explain why you might not have done something?
Yeah. Well, we all obviously did that with the workshops. We also, you cite Ryan Fisher and Pat in the study, and of course we work really closely with PPMD. One of the conversations when we had a 5-hour workshop with PPMD the first year I was at Dine, just to sort of kick off sort of structurally how I was going to build the patient advocacy group at Dine. I actually led that function until about a year ago. And one of the things Ryan said is, look, you guys communicate quarterly with all your other stakeholder groups. Why wouldn't you create a quarterly communications program for us? And I was like, that's a great question. Done. So we just started putting in place a quarterly communications strategy for that particular stakeholder group, being people living with these diseases, at the same time that we release content for everybody else. And I know from being an MDF, when a company goes silent, everybody assumes the worst. And if you're not communicating when you were communicating before, if you're not showing up at conferences when you were showing up before, if you're not donating and you were donating before, everybody assumes that the trial's going down or the drug isn't working. So I think it's important for companies to understand that communication is important just in terms of perception and visibility. And it's also, I think, to Wendy's earlier point, it's an ethical issue. If you're going to communicate with investors, you should be communicating with the people that you want to benefit from the therapy that you're making and that are expert partners in helping you design it. I will say one of the things I tried to do at Dine from day one was train people to talk about the people we work with as partners, not patients. And I tried to get the word patient off of the website. It's definitely not in the publication you cited. And it's something I learned at MDF. People don't like being labeled as patients. They're people living with diseases. They're adults, they're young men, they're people who have all these other characteristics that make them important. And one of them is that they have this disease. So we really did try to create that filter and that lens for people at Dine, which is, look, they're partners, they're experts. We reimburse them at the same level that we reimburse any other stakeholder group that we work with. And it's important to think of them that way. The other thing we did is we took huge photos of a lot of the different people that we consider members of our different communities, and we hung them all over the building. So now when we talk about our partners in Duchenne or our partners in myotonic dystrophy or our partners in FSHD, we talk about Howard and we talk about Sarah and we talk about Ravi and we talk about specific people. And it really, I think, again, to all the excellent points that Wendy was making, it helps humanize the work that you're doing and it creates urgency. And it gives people a mission. People, I think, given the opportunity, would like to get paid to be working on mission-driven work. And it helps really create this idea of you have a mission and it's urgent.
Well, you've been on both sides of the table in these discussions. What's the case you'd make for an early and often approach?
I don't, I think Isabel Lusada said it in the paper as well. You can't design any kind of quality product without involving the experts and the stakeholders and end users for that product. And you can't, particularly in rare disease, you cannot make assumptions about what you know and don't know, because you probably don't know almost anything. It's just too complex. These communities are too small, and these diseases are complicated. We created this notion of muscular dystrophy, and all that really means is that there's a dystrophic element to the disease that we're talking about. These diseases are hugely different, and you can't just pick people up and, people being drug development experts and drop them into these different companies and these different diseases and assume that they're ready to roll. They really need to get involved early with people that are living with these diseases to understand disease burden, to understand preference, to understand all of the elements that go into designing a potential therapy that might actually help them and what they actually care about and don't.
Molly, that's a really important point. And I just wanted to add to it. We had an experience once where we heard from the patient community that a specific outcome measure wasn't really relevant to them, not their goal from a future treatment. And our response was, well, regulators have said we have to include this because historic studies in the space had included it, and that was the benchmark. Yeah. And working with the patient group early, the approach then was to go back to regulators as the patient group and say, wait a minute, this isn't what matters to our community. More importantly, this is how this new study is going to evaluate outcome measures that are relevant and meaningful. And we were able to redesign that part of the study. And I think what I learned in that experience is, for all the right reasons, our regulatory team and development team was also making assumptions about that part of the process. But listening to the patient community and having that validity of, wait a minute, it's a different time, it's a different era, what are we doing? And the patient advocacy groups are actively engaging with regulators all the time. So it's another reason why this early engagement is so important.
Yeah, I would say to that point, one immediately thinks of 6-minute walk. And, everybody hates 6-minute walk. Sorry if anybody on the phone doesn't, but, and
regulators. On a mission to abolish it, Molly. So let's go.
And, regulators have historically loved it. So one of the things we did at MDF was the first externally led PFDD, patient-focused drug development meeting. And part of the effort there was to have something published in front of in this case, the FDA, to say, look, myotonia is a thing. It doesn't really matter to patients. Here are the things that do matter. 6-minute walk does not, like there are things that you can get into some of these publications that can help drive regulatory thinking. And I'll just put in a random plug here. If there's anything out there that you guys are trying to publish that will help those in industry make case to really key stakeholders like regulatory bodies, please don't hesitate to get that content out, because in the rare disease space, we're dying for publications. We're dying for proof to show to regulators that stuff is true. And the workshops and really important papers like the one that Global Genes just did are critical. The more the merrier, honestly.
Well, just to remind our audience, we are aware you're putting questions in the chat, and we're going to try to get to them at the end. But Parisa, Stoke is working in rare neurodevelopmental and seizure disorders. Children with these conditions present additional challenges as participants in clinical trials. How do your discussions with the patient community help you consider things like a child's ability to sit in place, a caregiver's needs, or the demands participating in a clinical trial will make on them?
Well, hi, everyone. Thank you, Danny. It's great to be here. This is honestly my favorite topic in the world, and I think most people who know me know that. So I will try my best not to repeat many of the incredible nuggets that Molly and Wendy already shared and that are all laid out in the white paper. And I'm also just pleased that I'll make myself available after this webinar, but also just on LinkedIn. Feel free to reach out if you have further questions. But I think, Danny, when you're asking your specific question about the area in which Stoke's lead program is in Dravet syndrome, I think we're dealing with many nuances in rare disease, but not unlike any of the unique communities from which we've already heard. And one thing to sort of point out is that we want to emphasize discussions in the plural sense. Molly already alluded to this, where companies who go silent are often kind of looked at suspiciously. But I will say that if you're especially in an early clinical program, and if you have the fortune to work at a company that is still in either preclinical or phase 1-2 development, this is not too early to hire a patient advocacy person or get the type of consulting that I think people in this position can provide. These discussions are the foundation by which we gather valuable insights that shape our clinical programs. They can be relatively informal, but are consistent, right? And their agendas could be fluid, but again, consistent, whether it's a biweekly or bi-monthly or quarterly touch point, regular interactions at medical conferences. So for us, let's say the American Epilepsy Society meeting, we go to this every year, and this last year was my third one. The patient advocates in this space know that we're going to reach out to them and schedule meetings with our members of our C-suite, as well as the functional leads of our clinical development and clinical operations teams, to gather insights into our planning at these informal settings. Why am I sort of bringing this up? Because it's a good way for me to answer your question, Danny, around these very nuanced requirements within communities living with seizures and with other, in our case, developmental and epileptic encephalopathies, the DEEs. These are very important questions for us to think through as we plan our clinical trials. And of course, downstream from the clinical trials, what really matters to families in terms of modifying their disease and their condition as opposed to treating their symptoms. Many of these discussions are really the basis for the systematic formal discussions that we've held at the advisory board level, and you've heard a little bit both from Wendy and Molly on this, so I'll get into that in a little bit later on. But largely, Danny, it's hearing from families about what their child needs. It's going to look different from family to family, and frankly, site to site and country to country. But the discussions are important.
Well, you're working with kids who, when they have a bad day, can really impact a clinical trial. How can working with the patient community better prepare a drug developer for these potential challenges and take steps to avoid them?
Yeah, thanks for, again, another great question. So our program includes an intrathecal administration of an antisense oligonucleotide. This is not a pill, right? So the study visits themselves are already cumbersome for a lot of reasons, just traveling to the site. But of course, once you're there, you have families who are, having their kids go through this lumbar puncture. And so from the beginning, we've had to think through, what does that setting look like? And actually, one of the groups that I've met with most recently, the Dravet France group, said something to me that has stuck with me. It's, how can you start to think about coupling the experience of going into the site visit with a positive experience? And for kids, these experiences could be so small as getting a sticker book that day and a new sticker book on that day of the site visit. And you know, whether the child is living with seizures or is having a seizure-free day is determined a lot in large part with how stressful that car ride was, or that train ride, or that plane ride, and whether their hotel has the appropriate refrigeration for their ketogenic diet needs. And so these conversations and these insights would not have been gathered if we weren't really regularly discussing these with the families. And to sort of bring it back to the ad boards, the way to formally and systematically collect these insights and really keep them in a place that is enduring, like an ad board summary report, is really, I think, best practice. You really want to make sure you're documenting these so that we're not coming back to the same discussion points at every single trial planning meeting, right? So hopefully that answered that.
One of the things that I find striking about the Stoke example, you know, we talk about early, but also often, and what the Stoke example shows, this is really a process of ongoing interactions with the patient community. It's not just a matter of sitting down once and asking a patient community to review a clinical trial protocol. In the case of your experimental ASO that you referenced, the company was conducting a phase 1/2 study while you were also doing 4 advisory board meetings in the United States and Europe to prepare for a phase 3 study. Who did you include in those meetings?
Yeah, thanks, Danny. We've actually now had 5 ad boards globally. And if it wasn't for those informal engagements with advocates, I think over the last few years, again, attending all the conferences and meeting with our C-suite so I can have that buy-in, right? I think that piece is really important, and maybe we'll touch on that. But the way these have actually evolved have been interesting, right? So we've had a couple of ad boards that Stoke has run in the US, but we've also held 2 community advisory boards under the auspices of UPADI and Eurodis with the European patient groups. This is the preferred route by which insights are formally gathered and documented. And most recently, I mean, we've talked a little bit about the financial implications, but there's regulatory asks as well. And if you have the information ready, it just makes your timelines go, you know, kind of speed up as well. You know that the pediatric committee under the European Medicines Association, so agency, excuse me, PEDCO, typically requests and require sponsors to provide evidence of gathering patient perspectives as part of a sponsor's pediatric investigation plan, or PIP. And these CABs provide a wealth of insights and documentation of the types of interactions you've had, so you can easily go to PEDCO and give them what they need based on the strategic way you've engaged with these patient groups through the CABs. In the US, we know that the FDA has launched the externally led patient-focused drug development meetings. They've been around now for a number of years, but at the end of those PFDD meetings, right, the patient groups also create a voice of the patient report. And one way we pull the advocates together is to reference the voice of the patient report and make sure that we're addressing the needs that the community, so families, as well as patients and people living with the condition, but also just really the caregivers in a pediatric population, are able to indirectly provide input into our ad board. To sort of address your question around who's included in some of our ad boards, I would say to you, and this is kind of something that I've started doing here at Stoke, we include the site coordinators as well as caregivers and advocates on one ad board. I mean, this gives you a wealth of information from what the caregiver is going through, what the advocacy group is hearing from the families, and the site coordinators who are there also to say, this is how I work with my primary investigator. This is how I work with the institution. And that also leads to a really trusting, I think, open conversation that at the very least, we are able to have this kind of transparent discussion. A final ad board that I think could be really, I think, informative for folks who are listening in is we had an ad board with US and European KOLs and advocates, just simply on the topic of communicating around our phase 3 trial. So it was a very, very granular topic, But a lot of times and often in the rare disease community, we may assume that our KOLs and investigators are lock and step with the patient advocacy community. And at the same time, there may be some gaps in communications and awareness. And this particular ad board was so informative because it brought the KOLs, the investigators, and the KOLs, who I think the patient advocates represent, also key opinion leaders, together to have the discussion at the same time. And it created just a whole flurry of insights that kind of we held accountable both parties, if that makes sense.
Well, are you getting insights about clinical measures or trial sites, or are they about how to reduce the burden on participants?
Honestly, every single thing you just mentioned has been included as part of one of or a few of our ad boards. So clinically meaningful endpoints, that's a whole topic. We recently, our colleague has published on what small meaningful change looks like for families and caregivers. We have advocates who are authors on this publication using a well-known tool to measure clinically meaningful change in people living with Dravet syndrome. There's an important topic here around using an external control. So whether it's a placebo or using a natural history studies results. And unfortunately, there's a lot more nuance to whether you can use a natural history study. And so even having that conversation about what pieces of the natural history study can be used to measure outcomes ultimately, which seizures are not necessarily even a hard endpoint. They're actually considered a soft endpoint because they're subjective. And so when you think through measures of cognition and behavior change and sleep change, you're now talking about even kind of quote softer endpoints according to regulators. But having the systematic, both qualitative and quantitative insights generated from caregivers living with this and caring for children with Dravet syndrome helps create that story in a very, I think, scientific way that allows the companies to advocate for different measures that should be included, even if they're secondary measures. And we know that payers are looking for that. And we know that there are tough conversations downstream that are reliant on the types of rigor you've used to design your phase 3 pivotal trial.
Molly touched on kind of the need for ongoing communication, but have you learned anything about communicating with potential participants about your studies and what's required of them?
So there is, I mean, at the end of it, right, there is some rigor and requirements to follow GCP, so good clinical practices and guidelines for clinical trial, conducting a clinical trial. And so for us to directly discuss this with participants is usually not allowed. And so you work with your clinical research organization, and we're actually in the middle of this right now where your CRO depends on how well you are communicating. You, the sponsor, are communicating with that CRO and holding them accountable. If the CRO has clinical trial educators, for example, at the site level, it is the sponsor's responsibility to make sure that the needs of the patient community and the caregiver community are stated to the clinical trial educators who are going to the sites and then are dispersing this information to trial participants, potential trial participants. One way that we've indirectly, and others have probably done this as well, have raised awareness of a clinical trial. Again, country by country, it's going to differ. But in the US, we've been engaging very closely with the Dravet Syndrome Foundation in the US, and the DSF could hold a webinar just to discuss awareness and raise awareness of the phase 3 trial that's coming up because their families have been asking them for it. But again, it's a lot of the ways in which the sponsors should and could participate in raising awareness with potential participants is really to take the cue from the advocacy group and to find out what their compliance needs are and where they're comfortable in having your trial study discussed and at what level.
There were a lot of interesting examples from Stoke, but one that stood out to me was the seizure diaries and how you altered them. Can you explain what these are and what Stoke did after feedback from participants and their families?
I can. I'll sort of say that this is a great topic, and it's going to keep a lot of people employed because it's one of the most elusive topics for those of us working in the epilepsy field to align around. I think There is not a simple solution for seizure diaries and capturing seizure data. There are different types of seizures. And of course, for a clinical trial that is measuring seizures, it is timing of a number of seizures, the duration of seizures, the type of seizures. And so the way seizure diaries have sort of, none of them have really worked well. There's a lot of apps out there. There's a lot of electronic interventions, as we know, with how to capture, record these seizure diaries. But unfortunately, in a clinical setting, you do need a very rigorous, consistent approach to this. And although families and caregivers would prefer an electronic or sort of application-driven seizure diary capture control system, we've heard from the sites and investigators that this is really challenging on their end. They lose data, electronic health records fail, and so this leaves families potentially in a place where, are you now, no longer in the trial? Do you have to start over? This is very, very nebulous. And so we have not ever used electronic diaries in our trials. And so what we did was, despite the fact that we are remaining with paper diaries, we have gone back to families and caregivers and advocates to gain insights into how we can optimize these paper diaries, right? We went from monthly to now potentially 7-day capture. The ways that they're, sort of submitted are also much more efficient in terms of how the caregivers and advocates have provided input. I do think there are things that you can do, but this is a great example of being honest and transparent and managing expectations of the community to say this is what we can and can't do, and having that trust that we've tried what we can, and this is a limitation of running a rigorous clinical trial.
I just want to remind our viewers that we're going to try to take some questions here, and we have some queued up, but let me ask all of our panelists, you've all had an up close and view of the growing sophistication of rare disease organizations and their growing involvement in research and drug discovery and even drug development. Industry doesn't often recognize the capabilities that might exist within a given patient community. What can drug developers do differently to understand the patient organization landscape and ensure they can leverage the work a patient community has already done? Molly, you want to start?
Well, I know, when I was at MDF, there were we did care and cure. So we did a lot of work to help build structure and capacity with respect to resources for care and quality of life improvement. And then we did a ton of work to try to lower barriers to drug development. When I started at MDF, we had one company looking at myotonic dystrophy. And when I left, we had 45. And it was all about what are the barriers to getting industry involved, and how do we lower those? And the only way to really get that information is to talk to industry. And I think having really open lines of communication between advocacy and industry around shared needs and agendas and outcomes is super important. The most frustrating thing is when you have either an industry group that doesn't understand the role that you can bring as a patient organization and patient voice and patient expertise and experience, or when you have, and this can happen in rare disease, when you have a lack of capacity in the patient advocacy space around where these trials currently are, where the development of therapies currently is, and where you need advocacy to play a role that no one else can play. Advocacy can get in front of regulators in a way that industry can't. Advocacy can make the case and make arguments for things like 6-minute walk and et cetera, that industry can't even get access to. So I think if I were going to say, what do I think is the opportunity? I think industry needs to understand how high capacity and critical the role of patient advocacy groups is in developing the work that they do. And I think advocacy needs to really lean into that relationship and understand where they need to play, where they're behind, whether they're addressing, one step ahead of where industry is, whether it's payers, whether it's the regulatory environment or what have you, so that they're really in a partnership situation moving forward as quickly as possible.
There's a flip side to that. We talk about the way patient organizations are evolving, but how has the role of the patient advocate within industry evolved, and does it need to evolve?
Happy to take that if if it's helpful. I've spent my career in industry, so on one hand, I feel very privileged that I've had the sort of very entry level. I was a sales rep at Eli Lilly when I joined industry. I have moved on to being an MSL, and I think over the years, what I've learned, and then I've been in advocacy for a little over a decade now, and I'm a bit of a recovering scientist, so I think this puts like the science hat back on a lot of times in my conversations. And what I've loved watching is not only the number of roles that have increased in this space. I remember when I was a rep at Lilly, I mean, I didn't even know what this was. But when I became an MSL and a position opened up to work in the HIV Hep C division in advocacy, I realized this is the bridge for the company. And at that time, I was working at Boehringer Ingelheim, which, started working on a patient engagement strategy holistically, all the way from early R&D through, I believe now they're even just really, really systematically working on engaging payer groups and others. But I would say this holistic inclusion is the thing I've just loved watching and witnessing. And I do think, again, maybe I'm preferential to the scientist part of me, but I think that level of, rigor and just kind of getting into the details, because the devil is in the details when it comes to some of the topics we just discussed. The 6-minute walk, and I've never worked in muscular dystrophies, but I have heard this. I've been a fan of Annie Kennedy and Pat Furlong for a long time. I've learned a lot in what that community has done for the rare community. And when I hear this, I think this is where, if you just put on that scientist hat, and we all have it somewhere in us, we're all very curious to learn about this. It is where you're armed with evidence to go back and make this claim for your communities to say, actually, no, this isn't right. And that is very detailed thinking. And I love that there is just so many more, patient advocates in industry these days.
Let me go through a couple of audience questions here. One person asked about creative financial assistance for families, specifically looking at the pediatric population to make trial participation more accessible. Many of the families that this person wrote about have multiple children and would need to take leave from their jobs to participate in something like a gene therapy trial in another country. Any thoughts on that?
I'll jump in here, and there are a lot of examples where additive assistance is provided to ensure trials are cost neutral and accessible for all different types of family scenarios. In a lot of neurodegenerative conditions, both adults have to leave to go be in a study, and then their childcare needs. So the needs are multifaceted. What we have done is twofold. One, we've built a patient-facing infographic for clinical trial coordinators to walk through exactly what is covered in the trial. And on that infographic is a box that says, are all of your needs addressed here? And if not, what's missing? Because we've found that most people were being told no at the site level, something isn't covered by the sponsor, but they weren't coming back to ask the sponsor. So it's been another really important way to get feedback into the study. Is we're now hearing from our sites, oh, families are asking for XYZ. So it's really fulfilling that early engagement feedback loop. And the second thing is, really working with a reputable partner to deliver the support. So whether it's copay assistance programs or the travel vendor, whoever that is, making sure that they're trained and in tune to the needs of rare disease families. So it's as important as saying, yes, we'll cover your transportation from the airport to the clinical trial site. But what that means is we'll have a wheelchair-equipped van waiting for you at the curb, and you'll have a dedicated driver for the 48 hours that you're here in case an emergency happens. It's not get off the plane and call a cab. So we've really worked to ensure that we're training at that level too.
Another audience member asked about when the FDA outcome measure is just okay but not great. You talked about the 6-minute walk test, but what can be done to design outcome-centered clinical studies? Has anyone any experience with this?
We do. We've done a lot of work working with our HEOR team, which is Healthcare Economics and Outcomes Research team, to really identify what are those hurdles and marry that with what we're hearing from a patient and patient burden input perspective. And I'll tell you, I think we have to hold ourselves accountable, because every FDA person I talk to says no one ever calls us proactively. So I think it's a two-way street, and we have to be willing as industry to make that outreach and say, this is what we're thinking, this is what we're hearing about, and not just wait for the 30-day meeting and hope it gets granted. So I think we have to look at regulators as our partners as much as everybody else.
I'll just
I
add,
know we're short on time here, but I wanted to give each of you an opportunity just to offer a parting thought. How can drug developers do a better job engaging with patient communities? Parisa, you want to start?
sure, this is what I'm going to address that last comment too. First of all, just reach out to the industry partners that you know of, just follow them, stalk them. If they're not responding back to you, you'll see kind of other ways to do it. But I think that industry really is interested in this. I think when it comes to advocacy, it's kind of in the term itself, right? It's vocalization, it's galvanization, and actually the question around outcome measures. One thing that many groups maybe we don't prioritize is to learn from other advocates and what they're doing, like in clinically meaningful change. There are several consortia who are working directly with FDA. So what we're doing is, even though that's not areas that we're in, we're supporting that work. So find ways to support each other as advocates, but also look for industry to support other industry partners. I think that's another really great way that industry can support advocacy, is by partnering with our fellow industry partners.
Wendy?
I think that there are three fundamental things we have to do. One is industry has to build the capability, and it has to be leadership capability for patient advocacy group engagement expertise. It's a different capability than the head of regulatory or the head of finance or the head of commercial. We wouldn't start a drug development program without those leaders at the table. You can't really authentically do this work if you don't have a head of patient advocacy at the table. And then that person is able to overcome the hurdles of, oh, we can't do that, or false assumptions about regulatory guidelines that don't even exist in certain countries, but it's urban myth. So it's really important to build that capability. The second is we have to invest in it. Patient advocacy groups, and Global Genes is an awesome example, are the only nonprofit stakeholder in the ecosystem. The only one. Everyone else is getting paid to be here. These groups are working as nonprofit organizations. So we have to really meaningfully build the right budgets to be able to support the work. And the third is really take this responsibility seriously. It's a huge privilege to listen and learn from patients and to bring their voices in, but we have to say what they want our teams to hear, not what we think.
And Molly?
I'd echo all of that. And I would say it matters where your patient advocacy group reports in. If it reports into communications, it really depends where it reports in, how much weight the company is truly giving it. And I think that's a consideration, in addition to just ensuring that you're hiring somebody who actually has expertise and background. And then I think on the flip side, take a look at the advocacy groups that you're working with. Are there areas where you can support, if they're doing great work in 3 of the 4 topics that you're focused on, and one of them they need more capacity, consider funding that organization to develop that capacity. Think about how you can enable these key partners, which are patient advocacy organizations, to get along next to you or in front of you in some of the work that you really need them to do, because at the end of the day, all of that is going to help people living with these diseases get these drugs sooner.
And I know Gio has reposted the link in the chat. If you haven't gotten the paper, you can download it now. But Wendy, this paper is really not the end, but the beginning. What is next for this work? This is an ongoing effort.
It is, and it will only happen if we have a lot of people join the Corporate Alliance and support the work. So please consider, if your company is not a member of the Corporate Alliance, reach out to any of us, Nicole, Danny, Molly, Parisa, myself, and we can definitely talk through it. But it's an amazing opportunity to broaden your horizon and look at the rare disease landscape as a whole, and not just the siloed areas that your company might be working in. But we do have plans. We want to publish a paper. We want to meaningfully see how this paper's been inserted into different industry practices, and then follow up with kind of a round 2 of interviews. If you look at the paper we've just put out, we have a lot of interviews with people across industry and very specific senior level roles, and being able to follow up with them and say, what did you do with this as part of the input to the next publication we'd like to do?
Well, I want to thank all of our panelists, Wendy Erler, Molly White, Parisa Sanandaji, These are a group of extraordinary patient advocates, and thank you for sharing your experiences with everyone. And thank you all for tuning in and joining us for today's discussion.